I bought a galactic cruiser no one wanted, then looked inside. The auction listing had been sitting unsold for 412 days when Marcus Holt finally clicked on it. He wasn't looking for a ship. He was looking for a distraction, scrolling through the interstellar salvage exchange at 2 in the morning the way other people scrolled through old photographs, half asleep, half aware, the way you do when you're avoiding sleep because sleep means waking up the next day still broke, still divorced, still running a one-man salvage operation out of a rented berth on Kessler Station with exactly one ship to his name, and a payment due on that ship in 11 days that he did not currently have the money to make. He was 38 years old and he had once been somebody, a decorated logistics officer in the Saul Defense Auxiliary, the guy who'd kept 3 convoys fed and fueled through the Vey skirmish without losing a single transport. And now, he was the guy who bought other people's junk hopping to find something worth more than what he paid for it. It rarely worked out. Tonight, scrolling at 2 in the morning, something stopped his thumb. The listing was for a vessel called the Calliope's Rest. The photo was bad, grainy, taken under work lights in some dim hangar, the kind of photo that salvage yards used when they wanted a ship gone and didn't care how it looked. The ship itself was enormous, a long curved hull nearly 600 meters from bow to stern, layered with armor plating that had gone the color of old rust, its name barely visible beneath decades of micrometeorite scarring. The listing description was 4 sentences long and read like it had been written by someone actively trying to discourage bidders. Decommissioned cruiser-class vessel, origin unknown, non-functional, sold as is, where is no warranty, no inspection report, no refunds. Buyer assumes all risk including but not limited to structural, mechanical, and unknown hazards. The starting bid was 8,000 credits, for a 600-meter cruiser. Marcus had paid more than that for a used cargo hauler half its size. He understood why nobody wanted it. He'd seen listings like this before, ships that came back from auction houses with a particular kind of flag attached, the kind that meant something about them had spooked every buyer who'd looked closely. He pulled up the ship's registry history and felt his stomach do something complicated. The Calliope's Rest had been found 4 years ago, drifting derelict in the Perseus debris field. No power, no crew, no distress beacon, no flight recorder data that anyone could recover. It had been towed to 3 different salvage yards. 2 separate buyers had purchased it and then, within weeks, relisted it without explanation, taking a loss both times. The third buyer hadn't even tried to relist it. They'd simply abandoned the lot fee and let the yard repossess it. Most salvagers would have scrolled past. Marcus, who had 11 days and a payment he couldn't make and nothing left to lose that the universe hadn't already taken, found himself oddly drawn to a ship that scared off everyone who got close to it. He'd spent a career being the guy other people wrote off, the guy whose convoy nobody thought would make it through the Vey blockade, and there was something in him, stubborn, half-broken, refusing entirely to be reasonable, that looked at a derelict nobody wanted and thought, well, let's see then. He bid 8,100 credits at 2:14 in the morning, more as a joke to himself than a real attempt, certain someone would outbid him by sunrise. Nobody did. He won the Calliope's Rest for 8,100 credits, plus a docking and recovery fee that ate most of what little savings he had left. And 3 days later, he stood at the edge of Bay 19 in the outer ring of Kessler Station and looked up, and up, and up, at the largest thing he had ever personally owned, feeling something between triumph and the creeping suspicion that he had made an enormous mistake. The ship was dark. Every external light was dead, every visible viewport black. Up close, the hull damage was worse than the photos had suggested. Long gouge marks raked across the forward third of the vessel, not the random scattered pitting of micrometeorite impact, but something more deliberate, parallel grooves 4 meters apart that ran the length of 3 decks, as if something enormous had dragged claws across 600 meters of reinforced hull plating and simply walked away. "Hell of a thing you bought yourself," said Priya Aconquires, the dock supervisor, standing beside him with a tablet and an expression that suggested she'd seen the gouges before and had opinions about them she wasn't sharing. "Power's dead. Has been since the salvage crew towed her in 4 years back. Nobody's gotten so much as a single system to boot." "I've got an engineer coming," Marcus said, which was technically true, in the sense that he'd sent 11 increasingly desperate messages to an old contact named Desmond Whitfield Vance, who owed him a favor from the Vey campaign and had finally, grudgingly, agreed to fly out and take a look. "You'll need more than one," Priya said. "That's a lot of ship for one man." She wasn't wrong. The Calliope's rest dwarfed everything else in Bay 19. Marcus's old cargo hauler, the one he'd be losing in 8 days if he couldn't scrape together the next payment, looked like a child's toy parked beside it. Desmond arrived 2 days later, took one look at the hull gouges, whistled low, and spent the next 6 hours running diagnostic cable into every access port he could find, muttering increasingly colorful profanity as each one came back dead. It was well past midnight when he finally found a single auxiliary junction box near the aft maintenance airlock that still had a flicker of stored charge in it. Not enough to do anything, but enough to confirm that somewhere deep in the ship's structure, something had not entirely died. "There's a reactor core in there," Desmond said, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had given up being cleaned sometime in the previous decade. "Buried deep behind about 4 redundant containment layers, which is not standard cruiser design, Marcus. That's not how anybody builds a ship. And it's putting out trace residual charge. Not running, not active, but not entirely dead either, like something put it to sleep instead of shutting it down. Can you wake it up?" Desmond looked at him for a long moment. "I can try. I want it on record that I think this is a bad idea." "It's on record," Marcus said. "Wake it up." It took another 4 days of work, rerouting power conduits, bypassing 3 separate failsafes that had apparently been triggered when the ship went dark, splicing a portable generator into the ancient junction box, and slowly, carefully feeding charge back into a system that had been asleep for at least 4 years and possibly much longer, before the Calliope's rest gave a single shuddering groan from somewhere deep in its bones, and the lights came on. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough emergency lighting flickering to amber life along corridors that stretched into darkness farther than Marcus's handheld light could reach, the low hum of recycled air beginning to move again after years of stillness, a ship the size of a small town slowly, painfully waking up. They went in together, Marcus and Desmond, both of them in environment suits because the air quality readouts were still uncertain, both of them carrying more weapons than Marcus would normally bring aboard a salvage job, because 600-meter ships with claw marks raked across their hulls had a way of making a man cautious. The corridors were strange from the first step. The proportions were wrong, ceilings too high for human comfort, doorways too wide, a width and height ratio that made Marcus's hindbrain prickle with the specific unease of a space built for something that was not quite shaped like him. The materials were stranger still. Most ships, human-built ones anyway, used standard composite alloys that Marcus could have identified blindfolded after 20 years in salvage. The walls of the Calliope's rest were made of something he didn't recognize at all, a pale, faintly luminescent material that seemed to absorb the beam of his light rather than reflect it, warm to the touch even after years without power, like it remembered being alive. "This isn't human," Desmond said very quietly about 20 minutes into the walk. "Marcus, this was never a human ship." "I know," Marcus said, because he'd known it the moment he'd seen the proportions of the doorways, but hearing Desmond say it out loud made it real in a way that pulling up the registry hadn't. The auction listing had said origin unknown. He'd assumed that meant the records were lost, not that the ship had never belonged to anyone human in the first place. They found the bridge 2 hours later, after a walk through corridors that twisted in patterns no human architect would have chosen, past sealed chambers that Desmond's scanner identified as having once held some kind of biological cargo, long since empty, past a vast central space 3 decks tall that might have been a cargo hold or might have been something else entirely, its purpose lost along with whoever had built it. The bridge, when they found it, was different from anything Marcus had ever seen. Not a forward-facing command deck with stations arranged around a captain's chair, but a circular chamber with no obvious hierarchy at all. A dozen identical stations arranged in a ring, each one surrounded by curved consoles covered in symbols that meant nothing to either of them. In the center of the ring, suspended in a kind of crystalline housing that had somehow survived 4 years of dormancy without a single crack, was a sphere roughly the size of a basketball, pulsing very faintly with the same pale luminescence as the corridor walls. "Don't touch it," Desmond said, with the flat certainty of a man who had survived 20 years of dangerous work by following exactly that instinct every single time it had ever occurred to him. Marcus didn't touch it. He stood and looked at it instead, and after a long moment, very faintly, words appeared in the air above the sphere, not holographic exactly, more like the air itself had agreed to become briefly readable. Characters in no alphabet Marcus recognized resolving, shifting, and then, astonishingly, reforming into something he could read. Vessel status, dormant. Command authority, vacant. Query, establish new command authority. Marcus and Desmond looked at each other. "It's asking if you want to be the captain," Desmond said slowly. "I got that," Marcus said. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest. "Why is it in English?" "I don't know, Marcus. I don't know anything about any of this. I think we should leave." They did not leave. Marcus, against every reasonable instinct he had ever possessed, against 20 years of training that said never interface with unidentified alien technology without a full Xenotech team and 6 layers of safety protocol, reached out and pressed his palm flat against the crystalline housing. The sphere flared brilliant white. Marcus felt something pass through him, not painful, not violent, more like being read, scanned, understood in a single instant by something patient and very old. And then the light settled into a steady, gentle pulse, and the words above the sphere reformed. Command authority established. MARCUS hold. Welcome aboard the Calliope's Rest. Initiating full system restoration. Estimated time, 6 hours. Would you like a summary of vessel history? Yes, Marcus said before Desmond could stop him, before his own better judgment could catch up with his mouth. Yes, I would. What followed was not a summary. It was 3 hours of information delivered directly into his mind, through some interface neither of them understood, and that Desmond spent the entire time trying and failing to detect with every scanner he owned. And when it was over, Marcus sat down heavily on the floor of the strange circular bridge and didn't say anything for a very long time, because what he had just learned was the kind of thing that took a while to fit inside a human skull. The Calliope's Rest was not a cruiser in the sense Marcus had assumed. It was an archive vessel built by a civilization that called themselves, in the closest approximation his mind could process, the Sevenfold, a species that had existed roughly 40,000 years ago and had built, across the span of their civilization, a network of these vessels for a single purpose: to preserve. Not weapons, not warships despite the armor and the scale. Preservation arcs, each one carrying a fragment of the accumulated knowledge, art, biology, and memory of a civilization that had known, with the calm certainty of beings who had mapped their own stellar neighborhood down to the decimal point, that their star was dying, and their species would not survive its death. The Sevenfold had not panicked, they had built. Across 3 centuries of dwindling time, they had constructed dozens of these vessels, loaded each one with as much of themselves as could be preserved. Knowledge, culture, the genetic templates of 10,000 species they had cataloged across their long history of careful, patient exploration, art and music, and the recorded thoughts of their greatest minds. and sent them out into the galaxy, scattered in every direction, instructed to find new hands, new minds, new command authorities, and to wait, however long it took, for someone capable of receiving what they carried. The Calliope's rest had been waiting 40,000 years. The claw marks on the hull, the system explained when Marcus asked, had come from an encounter 11,000 years ago with a predatory void organism. A creature, not a civilization, vast and ancient and mindless, that had attacked the vessel somewhere in deep space, and very nearly succeeded in breaching its containment systems before the ship's automated defenses had driven it off. The ship had limped onward afterward, its primary systems damaged, drifting on residual power for millennia, gradually losing function. Until 4 years ago, it had finally gone fully dormant in the Perseus debris field, where human salvagers found it and, one after another, recoiled from whatever instinct told them this was not a ship meant for casual ownership. Why didn't it scare the others off the same way it should have scared us off? Desmond asked, finally finding his voice. Query understood, the sphere responded. Previous claimants lacked requisite QUALITIES-4 command authority establishment. System assessment is continuous and passive. No harm was intended. Subjects simply experienced instinctive rejection consistent with incompatible command profile. What's a compatible command profile? Marcus asked. The Sevenfold built these vessels to be claimed by those who preserve rather than take. Your service record was REVIAWED during initial contact. You SACRIFICED personal advancement repeatedly to protect those under your protection. You continued this pattern into civilian life despite personal cost. This is the quality the Sevenfold sought. Marcus thought about the Vey skirmish, about the convoy he'd kept fed and fueled at the cost of his own marriage, which had not survived 18 months of him being gone, his wife eventually telling him, not unkindly, that she had married a man who would always choose the people he was responsible for over the people he loved, and that she couldn't keep being the second choice. He thought about every job since then, every act of stubborn refusal to let things, ships, cargo, occasionally people, simply be written off and abandoned. He hadn't known the universe was keeping score. The 6 hours of system restoration that followed changed everything. Marcus thought he knew about the future he was walking into. The Calliope's rest came back to life in stages. Propulsion systems that made human FTL technology look like rowing a boat, defensive systems that had been specifically engineered against the kind of void predator that had clawed its hull 11 millennia ago. And deepest in the ship's core, vast archive chambers containing exactly what the briefing had promised. The preserved knowledge of a civilization that had spent its final centuries trying to make sure that dying did not mean disappearing. There were medical archives that contained cures for diseases humanity hadn't yet developed the technology to even properly study. There were materials science archives that made human alloys look like stone tools. There were, preserved in stasis chambers that had somehow survived 40,000 years, and a void predator attack, biological samples from species the Sevenfold had documented across their long history, some extinct now for tens of thousands of years, existing nowhere else in the universe, except in the careful, patient preservation of a civilization that had refused to let extinction mean erasure. And there was art, rooms full of it, recordings and sculptures and forms of expression that defied easy human categorization, the accumulated creative output of a species and everyone they had ever encountered and respected enough to preserve. You understand what you have here, Desmond said, 3 days later, standing with Marcus on the strange circular bridge, both of them still slightly stunned by the scale of what they were dealing with. This isn't a salvage job anymore, Marcus. This is, I don't even know what this is. This is bigger than both of us. I know, Marcus said. People are going to want this. Governments, corporations. The second word gets out that there's a 40,000-year-old archive ship with alien medical tech sitting in Bay 19. You are going to have more attention than you have ever had in your entire life, and not all of it friendly. Marcus knew that too. He'd spent the 3 days since the restoration thinking about exactly that, lying awake in his cramped quarters on his old cargo hauler, which he still technically owed 8 days of payment on. A fact that felt almost comically small now, turning over the question of what to do with something that was simultaneously the most valuable thing he had ever touched and the heaviest responsibility he had ever been handed. He went back to the bridge alone that night and stood in front of the sphere for a long time before he spoke. "What did the Sevenfold want?" he asked. "From whoever found you, what were you actually built for?" The response took longer this time, as if the question required something the system hadn't been asked in 40,000 years. The Sevenfold did not build US to be hoarded. They built US to be given. The purpose of preservation is not storage. It is transmission. Knowledge kept SCALED is knowledge that might as well have died with its makers. The command authority is not granted ownership. The command authority is granted stewardship. There is a difference. We believe you already understand IT, MARCUS Holt, or you would not have been able to claim USAT all. Marcus stood in the quiet hum of a ship built by a species that had been dead for 40,000 years, carrying inside it the patient hope of beings who had faced their own extinction, not with despair, but with a kind of stubborn, generous faith that somewhere, someday, someone would be worth giving it all to. He thought about his ex-wife, and the convoy, and every act of refusing to let people be abandoned that had cost him everything a more reasonable man would have protected instead. He thought about 8,100 credits and a listing nobody wanted. He thought, well, let's see then. "Okay," he said quietly, "then let's figure out how to do this right." It took 2 years to build the foundation. The Halcyon Trust, established with Desmond as co-director, and a small, fiercely vetted team of scientists, ethicists, and engineers who understood exactly how dangerous it would be to release 40,000 years of alien technology into human hands all at once, carelessly, without structure. They moved slowly, deliberately, releasing knowledge in pieces, partnering with research institutions instead of governments, prioritizing medical breakthroughs that could save lives immediately over the more dangerous technological leaps that would have to wait for humanity to be ready for them. There were threats, in those early years, corporations that tried to buy him out, governments that tried more forceful methods of acquisition. A kidnapping attempt 8 months in that the Calliope's rests restored defensive systems ended before Marcus even knew it had started. The ship protected its steward the way it had been built to, patient and absolute. Marcus never stopped being afraid of the responsibility. He came to understand over those 2 years that the fear itself was probably part of why the ship had chosen him, because the Sevenfold had not been looking for someone who wanted power. They had been looking for someone who would carry the weight of it anyway, because someone had to, and because some people were built to keep showing up for the things they were responsible for, no matter the cost to themselves. 5 years after he'd clicked on a bad photo at 2 in the morning out of boredom and desperation, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Calliope's rest, watching Earth turn slowly below, and thought about the listing that had sat unsold for 412 days. He thought about the 2 buyers who'd quietly given up and the third who hadn't even tried. He understood now what the ship had been doing all that time, patient through 40,000 years and 3 failed claimants, and a vicious void predator attack, and 4 years of dormant drift through a debris field, waiting, with the same stubborn faith its builders had carried into their own extinction, for someone who wouldn't walk away. Desmond found him there, as he often did these days, and stood beside him quietly for a while before speaking. 8,100 credits, Desmond said eventually, shaking his head the way he always did when he thought about it. You bought the most important ship in human history for 8,100 credits. "I bought a ship nobody wanted," Marcus said. "Turns out that's not the same thing as a ship that wasn't worth anything." Below them, Earth turned, unaware for now of everything that was slowly, carefully, patiently being given to it. Behind them, deep in the ship's archive, 40,000 years of a dead civilization's hope waited to keep being transmitted, one careful gift at a time, by a man who had never once in his life been able to walk away from something that needed him. The listing nobody wanted had found exactly the person it was looking for.